Good evening, Bills Mafia in the house for the latest episode of Shout, a Buffalo Bills football podcast brought to you by, let's turn this off here, Syracuse.com, NewYorkUpstate.com. Joined as always by my main man, Ryan Talbot. I am Matt Parrino. And you know what it's going to be for the next month here. It's going to be all draft all the time. We got an awesome guest tonight. I'm looking forward to getting him in here, Ryan. But how you feeling tonight, my friend?
Hey, I'm feeling great. Like you said, it is now completely draft season, although the Bills are staying active here in free agency a little bit. But our attention is turned to the draft. It's going to be interesting to see what the team does here, less than a month away.
We're going to run through plenty of scenarios tonight with our good friend from the Draft Network is in the house right here, right now, Mr. Joran Reid. How are you, buddy? How you feeling? How you doing?
I'm good, guys. I appreciate you having me on. It's definitely been a pleasure.
We appreciate you coming on here because, this time of year, I love tapping into all of the expertise that is out there. I mean, you've been hard at work. I tore through all of your big boards and Mock Draft 3.0. I was able to check that out on YouTube over there. Definitely, I recommend going and just consuming all of Jordan's content because you'll become a smarter draft fan. But how are things going for you this time of year? Because it's weird. Like, we have all these pro days. What are you gleaning from those? And what are we missing without the traditional offseason, without the scouting combine? And I'm sure, like, I've talked to a couple scouts, it's just a little bit weird and different. What's it been like from your perspective?
Yeah, it's definitely been different. I will say that this has been a very unorthodox or unconventional year just because I think it was early March is when COVID really hit as far as the pandemic. And, if you think about March last year, really that's all the hay is in the barn in the sense the combine already happened and then things of that nature. So you already had all the information that you needed pretty much, especially with the combine happening last year. But this year, we didn't get the same amount of games. There was a lack of information that was missing. And there's a lot of teams that are still playing catch up, trying to get information on a lot of guys. So really their first interaction with a lot of prospects was at the Senior Bowl and some of these postseason all-star games when really area scouts, they go through those schools in the fall or sometimes in the spring of where you're able to ask the position coaches, the head coaches to get all this information on these prospects. So when you have these scouting meetings and when you're starting to form a big board, area scouts know exactly what they're bringing to the table and they have that background information as far as what's going and being fouled in their draft portfolio. But this year, without that lack of information, scouts really not having a lot of access to games, they were playing a lot of catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Jordan, most of our chat tonight is going to be about the 2021 NFL draft, but the Bills made a signing today. Forrest Lamp, offensive lineman, most recently with the Chargers. And when I was looking up information on his background a little bit, I came across some of your tweets back in 2017. He was a prospect you were high on. Now, he's battled a lot of serious injuries already early in his NFL career. But what did you like about him coming out, and how could he factor into Buffalo's offensive line?
Well, I like the versatility that he showed when he was at Western Kentucky. He had some experience at guard, and then he also had some experience as tackle, which is where he played his last few seasons there. And Western Kentucky, even though they got blowed out, they had a game against Alabama during his last year. And that's really one that really stuck out in my mind against him just because with some of those lower tier schools, you always worry about how they play against the bump up in competition. But he showed that he belonged in that game. And it wasn't just that game. I thought he put some really good film out there. And I thought he was going to end up being a first round pick. And I think he still went like 36th or 37th overall, if I'm not mistaken. So pretty much a really high pick in a sense. And I know he's battled some injuries and, his career hasn't panned out as best as he would have liked. But I was surprised that he wasn't signed at least during the second wave of free agency. And I think the Bills are really getting a steal in him just because I thought he played some decent football for the most part. And last year was really his first year of where he was healthy, primarily for the entire season, if I'm not mistaken. So I think Brandon Beane does a really good job of just collecting those guys on one-year deals as far as veterans with interior offensive linemen. And it's kind of like a war in training camp, just letting those guys battle it out and may the best man win.
If you're Forrest Lamp, I mean, I was looking for a funny gift today, and I didn't have the time when it was coming out. I was doing other things. But I'm sure a bunch of these offensive linemen kind of look at their phone when they get that message from their agent saying the Bills are interested, and they're just like giddy. I mean, running to the phone. How quickly can I accept this offer? Because you see, to your point, some of the success stories that we've seen over the last couple of years. I mean, Darrell Williams is obviously the biggest and grandest of them all, but even a guy like Quentin Spain, who didn't have a lot of interest in 2019 free agency, he kind of signed in the second or third wave, had a huge 2019 that earned him a 3-year deal. Obviously, that things went south last season for him. But this is a place where I feel like, I know the cliche, as Sean McDermott uses, his players use it, become the best version of yourself. Well, I think a guy like Forrest Lamp is a perfect candidate to come in here, fight, claw as much as you can to try to get an opportunity, try to make the most of that. And if it doesn't work out from the Bills' perspective, I mean, really, you're probably notching him in right now at 7-8 on the depth chart.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think the Bills have done a really good job of kind of shifting their culture. And I think they're really in the position now to take a risk like that. Even going back to last year, signing a Josh Norman, somebody like that, bringing in those veterans that can come in, and they don't guarantee them starting spots. They just say, hey, man, just come in, compete, and we'll see what happens from there. So I think the Bills are definitely in position, and they've established a culture and a roster like that to where people want to come play with people like this, like Josh Allen having the big year that he had last year, Stephon Diggs coming in. So Brandon Beane has done a really good job as far as establishing main guys on the roster, but I think he's done a really good job of filling out some of those other bottom tier positions of where now he can take a risk on veterans that are signing 1-year deals.
If you are in the comment section, please leave your questions. We'll try to get it to a couple of them as we go through the show. And then, we'll hang around afterwards, maybe dive into some more Bills specific stuff, react to some of what Jordan has to say tonight. But I want to start with something that I think is interesting, because we're at this point in the process where beginning of April, a couple weeks away from the draft, a lot of the work has been done. Where are you at in terms of, maybe give me two players, one that's maybe trended the highest over the last couple of months since the college season ended, and maybe somebody whose stock has dipped the most as we sit here at the beginning of April?
I think one that's definitely trending upward is Jaelan Phillips, the edge rusher from Miami. Was a big time recruit coming out in 2017. I believe it was. He originally started his career at UCLA, where he went on to have a productive freshman season, and then he had some off the field hiccups that resulted in him having a brief retirement, and then he ended up transferring to Miami. And we saw with Gregory Rousseau opting out, we saw Jaelan Phillips, that opened up an opportunity for him, and he really has taken advantage of that. Only playing 1 year at Miami, but man, it was a really good year for him, and now you're seeing him in discussions to possibly even being a top 25 selection. Now he does have, as far as some injury concerns, he has some concussions and he has some other stuff that's going on in the background with him. But if we take those injuries out of the equation and we're just talking about the prospect on the field, I definitely think he's a first round talent. Now, on the flip side of that, a player that really has, I would say, kind of regretting opting out, Sage Surratt, the wide receiver from Wake Forest. He's kind of a guy that's really trending in a backward direction. Things didn't really go as planned for him down at the Senior Bowl. And then obviously he didn't play last year as well. So he's definitely a prospect that's probably trending downward.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Ryan.
How much are those bowl games, the Senior Bowl, these local pro days, how much more are they factoring into draft stock this year than a typical year where you have a full season of film, where you have some of these guys who opted out on the air? So how much more stock is maybe being put into these Senior Bowls and all these other bowls that these prospects are playing and leading up to the draft?
Is huge. And it goes back to, my earlier point about this is really a lot of people's first interactions with a lot of these players. Just talking about the postseason All-Star game, there wasn't a lot of exposure as far as meeting them in person at games. They didn't really have the access to that, obviously, just because of the pandemic. So a lot of schools really closed their doors to scouts just because that was protocol for them. And what usually happens with these area scouts is that they can go in and they can interview the prospect, and then they'll go watch them at practice. So they'll be able to interact with them there. But now, them not having that type of access this year, the Senior Bowl, some of these other bowl games was where they really had their first interaction with these guys. So they held a lot of weight this year in pro days as well. A lot of teams really had to go in and do their homework and get their own numbers, just because there wasn't universal numbers, just talking about at the combine this year, that they could go by. So they had to hand time everybody that was on their draft board this year. So area scouts and evaluators really had to work hard this year.
You mentioned Phillips, and he's actually somebody I had circled that I wanted to get to specifically. So while we're on the topic, let's dig into him a little bit more. I'm interested to know your thoughts on how he fits, not only in terms of what Sean McDermott traditionally looks for in his edge rushers. I mean, big physical guys, strong hands, the ability to, be physical at the point of attack. I mean, they don't really necessarily look for those bendy super athletes on the edge, or at least they haven't, since 2017, since they've been in Buffalo. So I'm curious, how does Jalen Phillips fit? What does he do well? And how do you think he would fit into what they built on this D line in Buffalo?
Well, I'll just start with the player first. And I think pass rush is really, really where you're going to get the most from him. I think that's what his game is predicated upon. That's not to say he's not a versatile player. I think he's fine against the run. I think he's very physical. You can just go watch him against Duke and Virginia Tech. I think those were easily his best games of his career last year. But he has that different gear of where he has a very explosive first step, but also he can kind of disconnect his upper half from his lower half. And what I mean by that is he can bend the arc and he can run what's called like an imaginary hoop around the edge. And then also he can redirect and have a lot of things going on for him in that area too. So I think he would fit in very well. And I think edge rusher is something that they're going to have circled at the top of their draft board just because Jerry Hughes is getting older. They have some other players that are older at the position as well. And then, with AJ Epinesa, we don't know what he's going to be on the next level either. So we'll see what happens with that. Got my daughter's crying in the background. Sorry,
it's all good. Mine was crying right before we started here. So this is a family-friendly podcast. Don't worry about that.
That's right. So shifting gears now to the other side of the ball on offense. This year's quarterback class has been, I think, pretty well hyped up. Obviously, Trevor Lawrence has been the golden child at the quarterback position for the last few years. How does this quarterback class compare to the 2018 class? They had Josh Allen and Baker Mayfield, and obviously Sam Darnold, someone else that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes.
I think it compares very favorably. I think Trevor Lawrence probably will obviously be the top-ranked guy, no matter who it is, whether it's 2018 or this class, just because there's so little holes in his game overall. But now I think it gets really interesting after that, just because you're talking about Justin Fields and Zach Wilson and how they compare to guys like Josh Rosen and Sam Darnold and Lamar Jackson, even Josh. And if you guys firmly know that how many holes Josh had in his game coming out and how he was just picked apart during the entire process. And it's kind of reminiscent of what we're seeing with Justin Fields right now. And I don't have to get into the stuff that's going on with him just because that's just a lot of stuff that's going on, just ridiculous with him right now. But it was a lot of similar things with Josh Allen too, the level of competition and, him not knowing ball speeds and the completion percentage and how it was lower than 50% and the 60% threshold is something that evaluators use a lot. So I think it's very similar. Now, we don't have the athlete or the different type of specimen like Lamar Jackson was coming out. I don't think we have a quarterback like that in this draft class, but it's a very interesting comparison to make. But I think this one is a little bit stronger just because I like Fields a little bit more than what Baker was coming out. And then, Zach Wilson, he has a lot of favorable traits that can compare very similarly to Baker Mayfield as well. So I like this class a little bit more.
Yeah, it's funny you say you bring up Justin Fields. Like, I feel like the draft frenzy, in the media, and it's obviously become a fan event, and so content is at a premium this time of year. And I think that a lot of times, we get through this process and we get to this process and in deep and forget about the stuff that really matters. I mean, you go back to Justin Fields, some of the things that he was able to do, last season in Ohio State. I mean, he's a special talent. I mean, in my mind, I don't really see as high as you might be on Trey Lance. And I've read some things, and you can maybe get into that a little bit, what you think he can be. I think what you're getting in a Justin Fields, that proven ability to play at a high level, I think that sometimes we forget about that or don't value that enough.
Yeah, what happens a lot of times in the draft process is that people just get bored and they just look for holes to poke in individuals. And we see it predominantly with quarterbacks. And there's somebody that it happens to every year. It was Lamar Jackson when he was coming out. It was Josh when he was coming out. And then this year it just seems like it's Justin Fields for whatever reason. So there's always that one player that some people like to use as a punching bag. And it's not just quarterbacks. It happens at every position across the board. Caleb Farley is one guy. He has the injury concerns right now, but there's some people poking a lot of holes in his game too. But with Justin, I think he's a very high upside player. Reminds me a lot of Steve McNair is a name that's been floated out there for him a lot. I think he's very reminiscent of Steve, just trying to paint a picture of what he can be on the next level. And just like any other quarterback, he has holes in his game overall, but I just always revert back to Josh Allen and that you have to see prospects. And this is a scouting term that I love to use. You have to see them with both a microscope and a telescope. So, of course, they're looking at him with the microscope right now, just judging him what he can or what he is in his present state. But sometimes you have to look at it with the telescope lens as well, just projecting what he can be from a far view or in the future. And I think that's what a lot of people fail to do with Josh Allen, but that's exactly what the Bills were able to do, and that's why they have themselves a franchise quarterback now.
Here's a question in the chat here. I had the moment on YouTube from this class. Is Trey Lance most like Josh Allen? And me personally, I struggle to with comps in general, but that comp is really hard because you really have to project somebody like with an absolute once in a generation type of path that Josh Allen had. And so I guess trait wise, we could talk about that a little bit, but what are your thoughts on Trey Lance and maybe who's maybe a comparison?
Dak Prescott is the comparison that I used for him. I see a lot of similarities between him and Dak coming out, being in very run-centric type of offenses, a lot of tight ends, a lot of 11 and 12 personnel, of where he just wasn't he wasn't given the reins a whole bunch in the offense, and that's understandable. He was a redshirt freshman. He's only started 17 career games, but he has an undefeated record. And I think the 0 interception moniker with him coming out of his freshman season was a little bit misleading, just because he did have some balls in some games where that could have been intercepted. But as far as what he can be on the next level, I think he definitely can be a franchise quarterback. But you talk about somebody that has every single trait that you're looking for. He has accuracy to all 3 levels of the field, and he just has those tools that you love to see. He just needs somebody to unlock them for him. So I'm a big fan of Lance. It's just a matter of him and his inexperience. He's only going to get better with those reps, though. He just needs to get some reps. And the Central Arkansas game this year is something that a lot of people kind of picked apart with him, but it was one game. And I don't think it should have moved the needle in any direction for him. You really have to go back and look at his 2019 stuff. I think that's where you're going to get the best gauge for him.
Speaking on the quarterback class still, Zach Wilson is probably a name that the Bills fans need to get to know. It looks like he is pretty much locked into that number 2 pick for the New York Jets. Joe Douglas most likely just wanted to draft his own quarterback. He wasn't there for the Sam Darnold pick. But what were your thoughts on, one, what the Jets were able to get for Sam Darnold, and 2, the fact that they were able to move on or willing to move on from him so early in his career to now pretty much start all over again at the position?
Well, guys, what usually happens with the new regime, especially when they don't select that quarterback, they're going to want to bring in their own guy. And that's not just at quarterback. It usually happens across the board. You guys experienced it in Buffalo. They didn't necessarily clean house, but they wanted to bring their own guys in there just because I think it was like Marcel Darius. They took like the big dead cap hit for that. So they wanted to bring their own guys in there for that. So that's a similar situation as far as just talking about bringing their own guys in. But Zach Wilson, I think he's very talented. A lot of people had late round grades on him entering the year. And there's always this one guy that just comes out of nowhere as far as taking that next step in their development. We saw it with Joe Burrow a year ago, and Zach Wilson was that guy this year. And just with Sam Darnold, I think he's still very talented. I think it's just a situation of where he was just in a toxic environment with Adam Gase and then the lack of weapons there for him. And we all know, like, every young quarterback, no matter how they are, they need to have what I like to call the 3 Ps. So they have to have protection, they have to have playmakers, and they have to have a good play caller. If you don't have any of those 3, you're not setting them up for success. And I keep reverting back to Josh Allen. He has Brian Dable. They made the big trade for Stephon Diggs, and we see the resources that they pour in on the offensive line year in and year out. So with Darnold, as far as the transaction, we knew exactly when it was going to happen. We just didn't know when it was going to happen. So I was really impressed what they were able to get for him, though.
I was listening to Michael Lombardi's podcast the other day, the GM Shuffle, and I think it was actually his episode today. And one of the topics that came up was, Hugh Jackson. They like to, make light of him a little bit on that show for whatever reason. But a comment that he made recently about the decision between Mitchell Trubisky and Myles Garrett back in that draft. And Hugh Jackson was pounding the table for Myles Garrett. A lot of people in there wanted Mitch Trubisky. They got into that whole conversation. I'm not as interested in that as what an idea that kind of came from Lombardi. And he said, listen, if you're in the draft room, it's not about when you take a player, it's what a player can do for you. And he said, he obviously has been in NFL front offices before. He's dealt with coaches. He basically said, like, it doesn't matter when you take a player, it matters what they can do. And, I started thinking he kind of made light of like people that put draft grades on players and how that doesn't necessarily how it works inside NFL war rooms. And, I like Mike Lombardi. I find it entertaining. I like getting perspective from guys that have been in it and done the job. But then I kind of go to what we've heard from Brandon Beane over the years, and the fact that they do set up their board and they do put grades on players and they do kind of see where somebody would fall into the group. So, the big contention that Mike made was, don't tell me that, Mitch Trubisky's not a first overall pick. Tell me, is he a player that you believe in or not? Well, I think that there has to be some context there. I think that you're not going to reach on a guy, a quarterback. If, say, for instance, in this draft, if you like Trey Lance, but you don't like him in that top 4 range, if you're the Atlanta Falcons, maybe, and I'm not saying that this is the case, but you got to be sure when you get a swing in that top 5, that swing's going to work. I mean, what are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that even in the draft media, what a lot of people fail to do is that they just focus on what they can't do and then not necessarily what they can do, just because the hardest thing about draft media is that we're not drafting for an actual team. And what I mean by that is there's no specific scheme. We're not looking for certain type of individuals and certain types of check boxes that they check off. Excuse me. So with that, you're just grading players based off their tape. A lot of people don't really do background information either, just because you don't have to check that. Just because we don't work for a team, we're not worrying about building a roster either. So you really have to focus on what a player can do. Don't really focus on what he can't do, and then the value that he brings to the table.
Very well said. Running back position. That's been a popular mock draft pick for the Bills at number 30. However, they've also spent day 2 picks in the past 2 drafts on Devin Singletary and Zach Moss. So what's the upside to bring in a top talent at number 30 compared to what the Bills have been doing? And are the Bills almost hamstrung in terms of selecting a running back early in this year's draft based on what they've done in the past?
Well, there's always that one random team at the back end of the first round that ends up selecting your running back. We saw it last year with the Chiefs. And then it's really hard to project where running backs are going to go, just because everybody likes to say don't take running backs in the first round, just because what I like to say, you can find them at the local gas station and get production from them, just because everybody likes to recycle them throughout the league. But if I were the Bills, I would wait a little bit, but I think you have to take one, especially on late day 2, early day 3. And this class is kind of top heavy for the most part. I know Najee Harris has been a popular selection for them at 30. I don't even know if Najee is going to be there, just based on some of the things that I'm hearing. Travis Etienne is another player that's been projected to the Bills at 32. So it wouldn't surprise me if they do take a running back in the first round, but just based off what they have done in previous years, it would be very surprising to me. But I will say this about Zach Moss. I think you just have to kind of treat him as if he's not there. And what I mean by that is just because of the injury things with him, I don't think you can necessarily count on him in the future, just because he's gotten hurt constantly at Utah. And then the same thing has happened with Buffalo. So I think he's just one of those players that kind of is injury prone a little bit. And then with Motor Singletary, I think he's kind of best as a 1B rusher, as a complementary guy to a 1A. So if you're looking to bring in that bell cow guy, I definitely could see them doing that somewhere on day 2. Maybe somebody like a Javonte Williams. I think he could be a good pickup for them somewhere on day 2, or even a Trey Sermon like that in the 4th round, 3rd or 4th round. I definitely think that could be a good pickup for them.
I was checking out your big board earlier today, and it looked like you had 22 players with first round grades or first round value in terms of your charting. How does that compare to, the most recent years in terms of, maybe what's your record where, the most first round grades that you've ever given out for a draft?
So it's right on par with what I have done in years past. I think I had 24 the prior year to that in 2020. And then I have, like you said, 22 this year. And, based off what I've heard that goes on, just talking to scouting buddies, there's usually 15 to 25. That's usually like the standard number as far as first round grades that happen in draft rooms.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the wide receiver position, there's a bunch of guys at the top there. Those 3, it kind of similarly to last year when, that Henry Ruggs, Jerry Jeudy group, there was one more in there that were really good. After that, and this is a topic that among Bills fans, I think is starting to, gather steam, because as you go through these mock drafts, I mean, there's real potential that you take positions of need like edge rusher, a Jalen Phillips and maybe a Kwity Paye aren't there at 30. Some of the top cornerbacks not going to be there at 30. Maybe you address offensive line, but if you really want to make a splash, maybe receiver is a way that you can go. Maybe if a Kadarius Toney is there, I know a lot of people. Elijah Moore is another name. What are your thoughts on those kinds of guys? And are they worth that 30th pick? Because I've seen some mock drafts now starting to pop up with those names. What are your thoughts on those two players in particular?
Well, I'm a big fan of taking receivers on day two. That really seems like the comfortable range, especially of where we've seen success stories from last year. Even going back to last year, talk about like T. Higgins and Laviska Shenault, Denzel Mims. The list goes on and on of some of these players that were, drafted in the second or even third round on day two, of where they went on to have a lot of success. And it's not just last year; it's been like the past 4 or 5 years. And I can go on and on about the guys that have went in the second or even third round. AJ Brown. Terry McLaurin, DK Metcalf. I mean, you're just ripping off names here and there. So I think the second round is really where like that gold mine range of where you want to take a wide receiver. Somebody like a De'Ami Brown, I think would be a really good pick for Buffalo in the second round, or even Amara St. Brown in the third round at number 93 overall. I definitely think he could be somebody that they have circled on their board.
Absolutely. The other really popular position in mock drafts has been cornerback. Now, let's just say it could be round 1, pick 30. It could be day 2. Is there a cornerback in this year's draft class that you see being a great scheme fit for Buffalo? So someone, obviously, that's good in zone, that's assignment sound, able to recover, has some speed, and obviously tackling is really important to Sean McDermott. Is there one prospect that you say, man, if the Bills get this guy opposite Trey White, their defense is going to be that much better?
Yeah, there's one I think is going to be really high on their board. Maybe not necessarily at 30, but let's say they trade back maybe into like mid to late 30s or early 40s. And Eric Stokes Jr. from Georgia, I think he's one player that they're going to like a lot. Has a build very similar to Josh Norman, but you saw he ran 4.25 at Georgia's Pro Day. A very interested and willing tackler. He has the ball production. He had 2 pick sixes last season. And then also, I thought he was very productive for Georgia. So a true blue collar guy. That's something that Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott say a lot. They want players that are tough and just love the game of football. And that's the type of vibe that you get from Eric Stokes. So I definitely think he would be a player that they have a lot of interest in.
You also mentioned Caleb Farley and the back issues, the health concerns. If he were to fall to 30, how would he fit in Buffalo's defense?
He'd be a home run. I'm still a huge fan of Caleb Farley if he's there. At 30 for them. I mean, that would be amazing for them. But once again, it just comes back to the medicals and how comfortable they feel about that. But as far as the talent, you're talking about a player that's a top 10 to 12 talent if we're just excluding the back issues.
We got a question here on Twitter from VP GIF. Who are some of the day 3 defensive tackle sleepers that fit for what the Bills do on defense? And obviously, in terms of what they've brought in, they have Harrison Phillips, who's kind of that tweener between 1 tech and 3 tech at Oliver, at 3 tech star coming back at 1. They do rotate in a lot. Who are some guys that maybe fit either a hybrid or somebody that can kind of do a lot of things, or maybe even a backup 1 tech that they could start to develop behind Star Lotulelei?
Yeah, there's quite a bit in this draft class, and everybody knows that this isn't a great interior defensive line class. So if they're looking for day 3, Bobby Brown III from Texas A&M, he's somebody that I like a lot. A player that's not getting a lot of buzz right now, but he was very productive at Texas A&M. I thought they had a very good defense for the most part last year, and he was a big reason behind that. About 6'4", 310 pounds, so he's primarily your 1 technique, but he can slide over and play some 3. And we know the Bills like to rotate their guys on the inside quite a bit, and I think he can be that versatile type of guy. Another one is Kearis Tonga from BYU. He's more of your 2-down run stuffer type. That's very reminiscent of Harrison Phillips. Not going to give you a whole bunch on 3rd down, but as far as if you're looking for a 2-down run stuffer, I definitely think Tonga could be a key cog in the middle.
2 names that have been brought up in the chat are Tadarius Slayton as a 1 technique, and then Shelvin. Shelvin's been a very popular pick amongst the Bills Mafia, is that that run stuffer. Where do you see those 2 players falling, and are they worth where they would go in terms of what Buffalo does with their rotation?
I think Shelvin's probably going to go in the 3rd round just because of the value that he does provide. His pro day wasn't great, but he opted out last year. But as far as the value that he brings on the first 2 downs, I definitely think he's one of the better in this draft. Just a massive dude in the middle, 6'3", 6'4", about 350 pounds, but he's very athletic. And I really like what he brings to the forefront on that. And Tadarius Slayton, another guy, about 6'5", 360 pounds. So he's a little bit bigger than what Shelvin is, but another guy that's just a true 2-down. I think he's probably a 0 technique. I don't know if he's going to be a 1 technique on the next level just because he's not that super explosive, get up the field type of player. So you really want a 2-gap. And so you want to manning both of those A gaps for the most part.
Ryan on YouTube has a question. Who is a better fit in the offense for the Bills, Etienne or Harris? And I know that in your latest mock draft, you had Harris mocked to the Bills at 30. And I remember you talked a little bit about it on your YouTube page. And like I mentioned earlier, definitely go check that out. But who do you think would fit a little bit better?
I think Harris, just because of the value that he provides in both phases. And I think he can be more of that 1A type of role. I think I have some questions a little bit as far as ETN in that main role. Even though he did it at Clemson, I think Najee is probably better suited, and I think he's a better pass catcher and pass protector of the bunch too. So that's why I said I think he would fit a little bit better. And we know Josh really likes to throw to the running backs out of the backfield just because how much they've got involved, Moss and then also Singletary too. So I think Harris can be more of that running back that you can design passing concepts around. I don't think ATN is necessarily that guy of where you want him in creating mismatches on linebackers like Alvin Kamara, that how they use him for the Saints. I think Najee definitely can play that type of role a little bit better than what ATN does.
This has been great. Very informative as usual. Why don't you let everybody know where they can find your work? Because I'm sure as we chug along here these next couple of weeks, it's going to get more fast and furious as we go.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Jordan_Reid. That's JORDAN_REID. You can also find my work on thedraftnetwork.com. We also have a mock draft simulator that lets you play out all 7 rounds of the draft. So if you want to put yourself in Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott's shoes on draft day, you're able to do that. You can trade up or trade back if you want to get one of our premium prescriptions, if you have the means to do that. Also, you can find my podcast, the Reid Option Podcast, REID.
My man, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. Go hug your little girl. Tell her daddy's all done.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate you guys. Thanks as always.
Take care.
Thank you.
All right. Jordan Reid from the Draft Network. Awesome as always. Great insight, Ryan. Let's get into some takeaways here because, this is now our second week in a row here, focusing on the draft, bringing on an expert. And as we move through this thing, I mean, who are, at this point in the process, who are some of those guys that you have underlined as, if this guy is there at 30, this is a can't miss?
Ajiz Olajari, and hopefully I didn't just butcher his name a little bit. You see him all over the draft boards, though. Georgia edge rusher, going anywhere from mid-first to pick 30. I've seen him follow the Bills in a few. I think he's a home run pick. I think Equity Pay is a solid option if you're staying on that side of the ball as well. It's hard to project, though, because a lot of these edge rushers I could see going earlier than 30. Cornerback, I've been big on Caleb Farley. Again, Buffalo would have all the medicals that hopefully that they would need to make that determination on whether he would be worth the pick. Stokes has been another player who Jordan mentioned tonight, has been in that 30 range in a lot of these mock drafts, maybe a few picks later in early day 2. So I could see him fitting in. Brandon Beane, though, just keeps going out and signing these lower tier players to come in and compete. We've seen it on the offensive line. We've seen it at running back in the last few weeks. That doesn't mean that they're going to shy away from either of those positions, though, either. So right now, the Bills truly are in a great position. Best player available. I love that you brought up wide receiver because, you look at the wide receiver room and they're 5 deep right now, but they have a few guys in 1-year deals. They bring back Isaiah McKenzie. They sign Emmanuel Sanders. You get Cole Beasley, who's getting up there in age. So you do have to replenish that room sooner rather than later. And if someone falls into your lap in round 1, that's an intriguing possibility too, perhaps even more so than a running back.
Yeah, it's tough for me because I think depending on how this thing plays out and depending on your possibilities, I think for me at this point, the 2 guys that really stand out are Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah and Jalen Phillips. We brought it up with Jordan. This is a guy that, I've even been hearing that, in terms of trending upwards, is a guy that's made some real leaps the last couple months, and somebody that I think, listen, the value there could be huge. I mean, Quiddy Pay is a guy that everybody's talking about, the intangibles, the physical, the physical traits, all those things are great. I think Phillips might have a little bit more upside from what I'm reading and gathering and hearing. So if you can get him, but the problem is Pay and Phillips to me are two guys that are likely going to be off the board at 30. Owusu-Koramoah, probably the same type of deal. Although he's somebody that I think like a lot like Kyle Duggar. Remember last year when we were getting into, the final weeks of the draft season, especially on the heels of the combine, and Duggar was somebody that, some mock drafts had him going like in the 20s. So I think that sometimes we see a player that, obviously, is a great player and could fill a specific need for a lot of different teams, but maybe the draft community is overvaluing them. So I think that maybe if you're the Bills, maybe he's not out of the realm of possibility at 30. We've seen crazier things happen. To me, those are the two guys right now. Then Farley, who I also don't think is going to be there at 30. Maybe you entertain a Greg Newsome or in a crazy scenario, Patrick Surtain if he falls. But I think that I've seen it said a lot of times, trading back a couple spots at this point, maybe adding another top 90 pick doesn't seem like the worst idea, especially if some of those key guys that maybe you have targeted are gone and you're not able to trade up. Because that's the thing. If Jalen Phillips and JOR go in the first 22 picks, that might be a little bit too rich for Brandon Beane's blood to trade back up to try to get one of them.
Yeah, and even if it's not a 2021 draft pick, maybe he says, I wouldn't mind having another pick in next year's draft, a higher pick, if we move back a few. So I think he's going to be open for business if the right team comes along and makes a deal that catches his attention. I think the Bills have that flexibility. There's no one that they have to sit there at 30 and say, we need to target this position or this player and take that best player at that position. They can move around a little bit. They can move up as well. I mean, I wouldn't put it past Brandon Beane to go up and get his guy in the mid-20s if someone that he has as an outlier, someone that's still on his board that maybe he saw as a mid-first round pick was still sitting there. He's already shown many times in his young tenure as Bills GM that he's willing to get aggressive to go get his own guys. There's a question here in the chat. Actually, maybe it's not even more of a question. Does anybody beat Tom Brady next year? The answer is no from Jesse Smith. I get it. The Buccaneers got hot in the playoffs. They played great in the Super Bowl, blew out the Chiefs. But let
me just break in here because as you were reading that question off, I envision like Shawn Michaels climbing the turnbuckles and going to the top rope, ready to jump off and deliver one of his finishing moves. Like, are you coming for Jesse right now? Are you going to drop the hammer?
No,
okay,
I'm not.
I got that feeling. Like, I thought that we were going to have a great take that you were about to drop there. All right, go ahead.
No, but I'm loving all this wrestling talk. Hung out with Matt recently, and he was dropping all this wrestling knowledge. Blown away. I have like 2 layers of. All right, John. I have 2 layers of wrestling. I used to watch the wrestling tapes back in the Hulk Hogan days. I watched all of them as a kid. And then I watched like the Rock era, but once he left, I was out. We've talked about this. Understandable. Nothing wrong with that. But, there's no crystal ball. Though I get that Tom Brady has won many, many rings. He just solidified his status as the greatest quarterback of all time. But no one knows who's going to be there next year in the Super Bowl. There's a very good chance that it's not the Buccaneers representing the NFC. There's going to be plenty of teams that are reloaded that are going to be going for them. I get that their division got a little bit easier, obviously, with Drew Brees retiring, but let's not assume that any team's going to be in the Super Bowl. Just like a lot of people are assuming that the Chiefs will be in the AFC Championship game. There's no saying that it's going to be the Chiefs or the Bills. It's hard to get to those games year in, year out. So, let's not just assume that Brady's going to be that guy that's there at the end of the season because it's a lot easier said than done.
All right, let's go to this chat room here. Any questions? Anything you guys want us to hit? We'll hang around for a few minutes. I think there's a lot to talk about still. I want to go back to Forrest Lamp a little bit because I know we talked about it at the start, but I think that there's more to kind of unpack there. I really like this move. It has the vibes of what, that under the radar type of signing that, I saw a lot of comments when they signed, when the news came out, like, oh, he stunk. Anybody that played for the Chargers offensive line last year, flush him, like, it was terrible, all this, that. Listen, sometimes players, I mean, if you want to talk about players finding second life, in their careers. I mean, look at what's happened here for some players that have come to Buffalo and figured things out. I mean, obviously Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer are two of the greatest shining examples of that. But you go to the offensive line and look at and even internal players like Deion Dawkins, who had a rough year too. The Bills kind of broke everything down, rebuilt the coaching staff and talent around him. And Deion Dawkins has turned into one of the best left tackles in the league. I think this is a place where injury-prone players can come to try to get right physically. Obviously, the strength and conditioning and the therapy team that they have here to keep guys healthy. Players have been very outspoken about how great they run things in that facility. That's important. But I also think you take a shot on a guy with some talent. And that's what this is. And I think that you have to get to a point with a regime where you trust in their ability to evaluate and use their resources to take a swing on a guy. And hey, sometimes swings miss. I mean, Brian Winters was a swing and a miss. I mean, he came in, he was a depth piece. When he had to play, he wasn't very good. That could be Bobby Hart. That could be Jamil Douglas. That could be Forrest Lamp, who, by the way, $250 for a lamp, Ryan. Tell people a little bit about that. That's some crazy dinero.
$230.
Okay, I'm sorry.
$230. Yeah, so he has his own endorsement gig with Lamps Plus, and part of that was having his own lamp, the Forest. I'm trying to think of the official name of it, but it's linked in the article. $230. It can be yours. Beautiful base on it. Looks like you're out in the wilderness. So I do like the fact that he used his name to find an endorsement deal, or his agents did. So kudos to him. But, just speaking specifically to Forrest Lamp, I actually really did like this signing. He was someone that really held his own at the Senior Bowl, like Jordan mentioned on tonight's show. 38th overall pick in that draft class. And he's just had bad luck with injuries. First year, tore his ACL before the season even began, so he missed his entire rookie year. Second season, he came back. He was inactive for most of that season. And then the third year, he started 2 games. He was playing more, and then he had another season-ending injury later in the year. So this past year was the first season where he was completely healthy at the start of the year. He played 100% of the team snaps last year for the Chargers, so he was reliable. He started every game. He played every snap for this team. And like you said, that's, he could come to Buffalo and something could click further for him. He's very inexperienced at the NFL level, but he did have that full season to build off of coming into this year. And it's an insurance policy. If Cody Ford does not turn into the player that the Bills think that he can be, you have options. If someone gets injured along that offensive line, whether it's Mitch Morse, and then you have to slide John Feliciano to center, then you have another guard option with playing time, playing experience. The Bills do this every year. Brendan Beane brings in these guys late in free agency that have starting experience that can come in and contribute. Not every one of those players makes the team, and that's okay. But he has those options in his back pocket. They're going to come to camp. They're going to compete. And the best 8, 9, 10, however many offensive linemen they decide to keep, probably 8, 9 range, will make this final roster.
So check this out. Sal Capaccio, our good friend of the show, WGR 550, he keeps a running tally of the roster. And I kind of wanted to bring this up really quick just to take a look at this offensive line depth chart here. And try to maybe even create a depth chart here, Ryan, because I think that's where, we want to set things up. I think right now, as we sit here, that starting 5 is pretty crystal clear, at least going into camp. Things can change drastically. I mean, last year, before we started, I mean, people thought, Darrell Williams would probably get some reps at guard, maybe get some reps at tackle, maybe be in the mix to win a job, maybe if he performs well. Well, day one, he went in there and he was the right tackle. So things can change. But if you're talking about right now, Mitch Morse at center, Deion Dawkins left tackle, Darrell Williams right tackle. That's set. I think John Feliciano, as of right now, is your right guard, and Cody Ford is your left guard. And then things get super interesting because I think Ike Bucker started, 8, 9 games last year for this team. Ryan Bates is a guy that, he has he just has this vibe around him that it could be any time he breaks out and wins a starting job. I think he's going to really test some guys this training camp period, push some guys, I should say. The problem for him is I think they really do view him as a tackle, and in that scenario or that backup center role. So it's going to be tough for him to, unless they want to use him at guard. So he's probably going to end up being your swing tackle, at least going into the year. They like Jordan Devy. Trey Adams is a mega developmental talent, and that's a guy that people often ask us about. And I think he struggled at times, especially even as we got into the season, which rightfully so. Undrafted free agent, no offseason, everything that happened with COVID. And then you have that pack of three players in that second and third wave of free agency in Hart, Douglas, and Lamp, who I think are all going to come in here. Hart probably the least in terms of who I'd say has a chance to push somebody for a job, then probably Douglas a little bit ahead of him. I think Lamp is a guy that I'm not going to sit here and call it, if you will, that he's going to push anybody for a job. But out of the three, I think he's probably got the best odds.
I agree with that. And of the starting five, I think you can put four of them in Sharpie. I think Cody Ford is the only one that you can't really put in 100% right now. Obviously, Brandon Beane is high on him. Postseason comments about how they envision using him, how he's been injured, how much they really like him still. Everything points to him being the day one starter, but he still has to win the job. And like Butker is going to push him a little bit. Lamp could end up being someone that pushes him from playing time. I like these signings. Not everyone sticks, but he's also shown, that being Brandon Beane, that some of these guys that aren't going to make the roster, he can swing them in a trade and get a day 3 pick, whether it's in this year's draft, next year's draft, conditional pick. Because offensive linemen, there are always teams looking for players with experience, and he's shown time and time again that he can get some value. He did it with Russell Bodine, of all players, who really came in here and did not do much with Buffalo. So if he can do that, he could do this with a Forrest Lamp, or he could do that with a Bobby Hart, whoever is that odd man out come August.
Looking through the comment section here, if you do have any last minute questions here, get them in. Looking at that roster, Ryan, wide receiver is so deep. And we were talking about the possibility of going, day 1 or day 2 at wide receiver. And I think it's smart because you got Cole Beasley to a degree. You got Cole Beasley who, is getting older. This is the 3rd year of a 4-year deal. They can move away from that next year. I mean, if they wanted to. I'm not saying that they should or that he's even trending in a poor direction. I think Cole Beasley's set up to be really effective into his 30s. Like, depending, as long as he can stay healthy. And then Emmanuel Sanders is probably, at best a 2-year option, more realistic, probably a 1-year option. So to add another player into the mix, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. But when you go down this wide receiver list, it's so impressive. I mean, there's guys, and maybe we're overvaluing a couple of these guys, but I'm just talking about guys with NFL experience. Duke Williams, who's caught big touchdown passes in the NFL. Jake Kumaro with that big one last year. Guys that don't have a big body of work, but guys that I think could be in the mix, or at least you could trust to play. And then the unknowns of Isaiah Hodgins, Isaiah McKenzie a little bit to a degree. What would he look like in a larger role? And then Gabriel Davis, I still think that's one of the great unknowns going into next year is what role is he going to assume with Sanders in the mix now, who's kind of an alpha. Can Gabriel Davis assume that number 2 role? I think these are all fun questions that become even more interesting to debate depending on how the Bills address the position in the draft.
Yeah, and even Tanner Gentry to a lesser extent. I know that his odds are stacked against him, but that was Josh Allen's favorite target at Wyoming. That's one of his closest friends. He could come in here and they could have an instant rapport, pretty much take off where they left off at the college level, and he could make his case for a spot on this roster. The Bills go deep, but they can say, okay, Isaiah McKenzie, he is a wide receiver. He's our gadget guy, but we can also kind of put him in that Andre Roberts spot where, yes, he's one of our receivers, but when we're saying we're going to keep 7 guys, one of those 7 is our return man, and that's what Isaiah McKenzie is. And then it's, the next 6, and then it gets tough because obviously Diggs and Beasley and Gabriel Davis and Emmanuel Sanders, they're all locked into those spots. And then it kind of comes down to do you take a rookie early that you think could be a long-term factor, someone opposite Stephon Diggs, someone that brings us something a little bit different than what Gabriel Davis does, because Davis was outstanding when Josh Allen had to roll out in terms of getting open, making plays. So it's going to be really interesting, but I wouldn't put it past the Bills to attack that wide receiver position early, because as strong as that unit is, the saying is you got to keep your fastball, and that's what Buffalo needs. They need to keep giving Josh Allen weapons, and really taking a wide receiver high this year, it's not a bad idea. You don't have to rush them onto the field, but they're going to have a lot of really good players to learn from as a rookie as you bring them on slowly.
Yeah, I see some people in the comments here. John's like, they keep having these shows during my gym time. Well, I apologize. We try to make it consistent on these Wednesday shows, so you guys always know when we're going to be live. But we're always open to changing things around. And as we go through the offseason, it's going to be interesting because we're going to mix things up a little bit. Next week is our 1-year anniversary show. So we started the podcast almost 365 days ago. So next week, we're going to have some giveaways. We're going to do a live mock draft. I'm still, as a matter of fact, why don't you guys comment and let me know who you want. I think I want to do Buffalo media just because I want to really zero in on that 30 pick in terms of what everybody wants. So if you have any requests, get them in the comment section. And make sure to tag me. I'll look for it. So we'll do that show next week. We'll bring in some special guests. I'm excited about that. But yeah, there's a lot going to be. I'm excited for May too, because I really want to see what this entire picture looks like now as we move into the off season and maybe into some workouts, hopefully, depending on what the NFL decides to do, Ryan.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Boy, we have some fans here in the comments, Matt, that are digging deep. Look at this question. I love it, though. Pick your 3 backup offensive linemen to make the game day roster each week. Well, Ryan Bates, most likely, I think, claims one of those spots because he can play all across the line. I think like Butker, if he's not starting, he has that interior experience. And then maybe it is a Forrest Lamp. I can't really solidify that third spot, but I love those questions that kind of make me do a double glance and look. That one definitely caught me off guard. What do you think? Is anyone that you disagree with off that list?
No, I think that's about right. Right. Pick your 3 backup O linemen that make the game day roster each week. Well, I will say that they do like rostering 8 offensive linemen, and I think Butker, Bates, and Lamp make a lot of sense. I think depending on this, who's training with Ike Butker this offseason, I've seen it on their Instagram, is Trey Adams. They're out together, working together. I'd be interested to see if Trey Adams can't make a jump. And I wonder what the year of just practice did for his body, because that was one of the big knocks on him coming out, right? That he couldn't stay healthy. Mm-hmm. He struggled, I think, getting a year in the Buffalo Bills program and then getting a chance to spend some time this offseason with a guy like Ike Butker, who is, could you get any more process than that guy? The way that he's earned his spot on this roster is about as Billsy as you can get. So I think that's somebody that I would keep an eye on, maybe on the low, is a Trey Adams, maybe to compete for that swing tackle job. I think Ryan Bates still can be that utility man as well. But I like a lot of the competition. And I'm right. Depending on who's there, I do not rule out offensive line at any time in this draft. Like I think we could sit here and say, Elijah Vera Tucker, who is probably the top interior offensive lineman in the draft, that wouldn't be crazy to me at 30. It's not a glaring need, but depending on where you are in terms of your faith in a Cody Ford and an Ike Butker long term, and those kinds of things, going that route is not crazy. And there's some interesting players. Liam Eichenberg is a tackle who also, I've read that he can maybe potentially be a guy that can move inside to guard as well. So I think they're going to like Landon Dickerson. I don't know if maybe they will. Mitch Morse is in year 3 of a 4-year deal. Who knows? I'm not taking anything off the table, I guess is my point. I think that's a astute observation.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And even if not day 1, day 2, Quinn Meiners, I always mispronounce that last name. Wisconsin Whitewater versatility to play guard or center, another one of those small schoolers that really held his own at the Senior Bowl, proved that he belongs up there against the big boys. I could see him being a fit for this team. Brandon Beane is going to pick the best player for this team, not just in 2021, but long-term, because you're always trying to fill in those gaps, not just what you need now, but what you know you're going to need sooner rather than later.
Did you listen to Josh Allen on Kyle Brandt?
I did. I'm a little disappointed that he missed the fireball question. That one stung because those were a childhood favorite of mine.
So what you're not going to get on this podcast is any reaction to any vaccine discussion. But I do want to get into a little bit of Josh Allen's podcast appearance with Kyle Brandt because I thought it was interesting. And, Trey White actually made a rare podcast as well, appearance on Chris Collinsworth's show. And I gave both of those a listen, and I put up some stories this morning on them. And I think that one of the things that both of them discussed, I think in serious hindsight now, is the Kansas City game and what went wrong and what they have to do a little bit different. I was going to write, I did the Trey White one because I thought what he said about Sam Darnold was super newsworthy, but check out this quote from him on what happened in that Kansas City game. And we'll react to it a little bit. This is Trey White. We're going to talk about Josh Allen too. Just go out and execute your game plan. Chris Collinsworth asked Trey White, what do they got to do to catch up to the Chiefs and beat the Chiefs? Don't try and do anything different than your game plan. Go out and be confident in what your coaches in the scheme that you're going to be executing. Be confident playing. You got to know it's going to work. You got to believe it's going to work. Going against Patrick Mahomes, it's so tough because he sees the field so well. Those guys are so fast, and somebody has to be covered one-on-one. And they're so fast. You just have to play the perfect game and somehow have a little bit of luck. But you have to make the plays when they present themselves. When Patrick is running around and he throws that crossbody pass that he always completes, we some kind of way have to come up with an interception on that. Did they have any takeaways in that game, Ryan?
No. Not that I can recall. No, I mean, the only time that they punted in that game was after Mahomes delivered, I think it was like a 35-yard pass to Tyreek Hill, hit him on the hands, and he dropped it. That's the only time they even punted the ball in that game.
Right. And I think it was Trey who got beat on that one. So I think he's probably talking a little bit about himself, taking advantage of your opportunities, playing a little bit better and covering a little bit better. I think everybody, they took ownership of that. That's nothing new. You got to take advantage of your opportunities to the maximum. Maximize all your possessions because those things are going to play a big time role in changing the game. Those guys, eventually, they're going to make some plays, that offense. And let's be honest, that's true. They're going to burst on the scene and have a big splash play. But you've got to try to limit those things and take advantage of those opportunities. When you get a fumble down in the red zone, you need the touchdown, not the field goal. You need the points. It's interesting there. And, I think that first and foremost, all of this offseason discussion that we've had about what the Bills have to do to elevate the roster to be able to deal with the Kansas City Chiefs, I think a lot of the answers are right there on the roster. I think you got to just play better in a lot of ways. It was a big spot. We've talked about the coaching decisions, some of the puzzling ones. He didn't say coaching, but getting touchdowns instead of field goals. Yeah, you got to be aggressive when you're talking about opportunities. Being in the red zone against the Kansas City Chiefs is an opportunity, and you have to try to score a touchdown there because especially with the way that game was going, Ryan, I think you go back and watch it and you feel the momentum, after the Bills go up 10-0 and Kansas City just bolts right back into it. And it seems like the marathon is starting. You got to be able to take that baton and score touchdowns. And they weren't able to do that. And I think that that's something that in that game, again, another year with the nucleus of talent. And that's another thing. Don't forget that this Patrick Mahomes core of group of players, that was their third year together, basically, right? 3 straight AFC title games, Super Bowl championship. When it comes to knowing your personnel, Patrick Mahomes had a head start on Josh Allen. He was at a further stage of it than Josh Allen was. So I think just that piece of it you advance a year, and Josh Allen said it on the show with Kyle Brandt. Hopefully we can play that game in Buffalo this year. That would be obviously a much needed advantage. I think that there's a lot of answers on the roster as it is right now when you talk about developing a lot of these players.
Yeah, and when you're talking about Trey's responses, the kicking field goals versus touchdowns, first of all, the Bills were really aggressive during the regular season in terms of going for it on those fourth and manageable spots, and they weren't in the championship game. And I know Sean McDermott said, you take the points, you want the points, but against a team like the Chiefs, especially, a field goal is not going to do much at the end of the day. You do need those touchdowns. Trey mentioned you need the perfect game plan. That game plan was far from perfect. They were letting Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill run wide open in the middle of the field. They couldn't really cover them, where they kind of did a good job of taking Hill out of the game a little bit in that first matchup. And they had Saran Neal on Kelce at times, and he was kind of physical. You didn't see that in the championship game, and that kind of worked against him. But he's right. You have to, sometimes it's a matter of making plays, making the most of situations. And I actually go back to Kansas City's game against Miami in the regular season, where Miami almost knocked them off because when Mahomes was throwing a ball, someone at the first or the second level was able to get a fingertip on the ball and tip it, and that led to, I want to say, he had 3 interceptions in that game. The Bills weren't able to get to him, but they weren't also able to really bat any balls up into the air and make those opportunistic plays that Miami did in that regular season matchup. And that can be the difference in a game, and especially an AFC Championship game. If the Bills could have forced a few turnovers in that matchup, then the Bills may have been in that late into the game, and it could have been whoever had the ball last would have won. So they didn't make the most of the opportunities. I know we're talking about Trey here, but I also love the fact that Josh Allen said that loss is something that sticks with him to this day, because it was the same thing that he said last year after they had lost in that wild card game to Houston. So I'm sure this is something that's going to fuel him. He's going to want to come in this season. And it's hard to build on a season where you finish second in MVP voting, but I'm sure that Allen has all intentions of doing that and more here in 2021.
Yeah, you mentioned Josh Allen. We can get to him. What were your big takeaways from his appearance on the show? He talked about a couple things, and one of them was his looming contract extension.
Yeah, he played that pretty well down the middle, pretty much saying, when it happens, it happens, because I think, one, you let your agent handle these things for a reason, because right now, as much as I'm sure he would like to be signed long-term by Buffalo, he also knows, and his agent also knows, that there's a big contract coming the league's way, or that they're signing off on with TV revenue, and it's going to make that cap skyrocket. So if he signs this offseason for $41 million on average, that could end up being an underpayment in a year or two based on what the cap looks like. So maybe it is kind of a weighted out process. So he was very diplomatic in terms of how he spoke on that. I did find it interesting when he was talking about Cam Newton and how he feels really small next to Cam Newton, because they were it sounded like they were kind of training together, because he works with Jarrett Stidham, and Cam Newton was down there working with some New England guys. He said, when I was standing next to him, I felt tiny. So it is interesting to see that he still looks at Cam Newton and holds him in such a high regard. But a lot of little fun, interesting tidbits in that interview.
Yeah, I thought it was a cool format, first and foremost, like the 10 questions. You have the trivia game, but you also work in some different interviews. And I'm not surprised. Kyle Brandt, very entertaining on that show. But Good Morning Football. But I think that, Elliot Eisler, a great listener of the show. Shout out to Elliot. What's up, buddy? Great point, saying how the pandemic allowed him to, work on his mechanics and really hone in on some of the things that maybe weren't going right for him in his first 2 years. Joseph Diodato says, why is he training with Patriots quarterbacks? Well, I guess he's really good friends with Jarrett Stidham. Obviously a bunch of quarterbacks down there that work with Jordan Palmer, Sam Darnold, Kyle Allen. I believe last year Joe Burrow was down there. I'm not sure if he's down there now. But they're all very super close. And speaking of quarterbacks, Ryan, I got a big story coming out next week, Monday. I'm really excited about it. It's on Davis Webb. I don't want to give away too much, but I think hardcore Bills fans are going to want to rip into this story. It's a lot of the behind the scenes stuff. Davis Webb, I told you about it the other day. He could be the most interesting Buffalo Bill on the roster, which is a crazy distinction considering he's a practice squad player basically at this stage of his career. But I think when people read the story, they're going to really get a kick out of it. I talked to some people, and it's going to be fun. But before we get out of here, final thought, Ryan. Anything else before we call it quits?
Final thought, yeah, don't be surprised if Brandon Beane makes a few more of these one-year signings between now and night one of the draft, but also keep in mind that regardless of the position, it's not going to matter in terms of what the Bills do at pick 30. We've seen it before where they sign a running back right before the draft like they did with TJ Yeldon, and then they ended up adding a Devin Singletary that year on day 2. They're adding all these offensive linemen. It does not rule out the Bills from taking offensive linemen in round 1, round 2, round 3. He is simply adding some insurance to this roster now, not knowing how the draft board is going to fall here at the end of the month. So these signings do not eliminate any position. Obviously, quarterback's not being taken in round 1. We can eliminate that in special teams. But every other position, that's fair game, and I think that's kind of exciting if you're a Bills fan.
For Ryan Talbot, I am Matt Parrino. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Great to get some insight from Joran Reid. We will be back next week with our anniversary edition. It's going to be a live mock draft. So we're going to go pick 1 through 32, and then we're going to come up with our best laid plans for maybe day 2 of the draft at that point. Pick 61 and 93 for the Bills. It's going to be fun. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see